All right. I think it's 6 minutes over. I think that's enough time to give people to jump in. So I'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody. So this is landing a job 101. Kind of my tips and tricks of what I've learned of uh, trying to get a job when I was graduating and going through university for the first time. My name is James Wong. I'm currently the chief engineer for Smart Racing Electric, and I graduated from UC San Diego in 2016, and I've been through a couple of jobs since then. And so I just wanted to share my experiences and the things I've learned and gathered over the years. Um, so if you guys have any questions or comments you want to make, feel free to chime in uh, at whatever slide I'm on. I'll try to answer whatever I can. And that being said, I'll go ahead and get started. So, steps to landing a job. I think there's a couple of steps, and the first one is being part of Formula SAE or any of the SAE branches. And then there's networking, applying, and then preparing for the interview, follow up, the offer, and then the actual job. So the first step is Formula SAE. I think it's really important to note that Formula SAE pretty much trains you and prepares you for what you need to be able to handle in, say, like a normal engineering job. It prepares you for how to solve issues, perform like FEA, do SolidWorks or CAD work, um, and communicate with team members. And basically, this organization essentially acts as a just another job, but while you're in university, it's basically like a startup. So it essentially teaches you all the fundamentals that you need to learn, and it's the first step of being able to secure a job, in my opinion. So when you're in Formula SAE, you should learn how to learn. So be a sponge and always try to absorb as much information as you can, learn everything you can, say about the car or conceptually, how does the car work? How does aerodynamics work? How do composites work? Adhesives, everything that you can. You'll never know when, say, you come across this issue on a job and you need to be able to explain to your boss, like, how does this work? What kind of solutions do we need to solve this issue? And so I think being part of Formula SAE is the first step in ever getting your first actual engineering job. This doesn't all have to apply to only engineering, though. I think a lot of this is applicable to any field of industry. So included with that is always try to improve your technical and communication skills. And it's I want to emphasize communication skills because this is something I didn't really realize when I was graduating. I always kind of thought of it as, an engineer is just about being technical and understanding like physics but no, I think probably 80% of what makes a good engineer is being able to communicate and convey ideas effectively and efficiently to your peers, to your boss, uh, to whoever you're trying to convince that your solution is the right one. And so that means presentations are vitally important. That's something that try to maximize on your presentation and presenting skills while you're in Formula SE, because at least I didn't realize it, but when I went into industry, this is pretty much like a daily function that you should be able to perform. It's something that I have to do daily. I make presentations all the time. I present to the U.S. government all the time. It's something that you should try to practice as soon as possible and as much as possible, because it's something you'll see every day. And then teamwork. Formula SAE always emphasizes working together. And I think being able to work together in a team is incredibly important for what employers look for. You'll find that projects are never never successful because of just one person. It always takes together a team of people to make a project happen, to make like your power chain happen, and you should always try to be able to um, work together with other people, and be able to communicate with people even if they're difficult to work with. And then it also teaches you hard work and dedication, was something that employers always look for. So the more that you do hard work and dedicate yourself into Formula SAE, the more it'll show when you do talk to employers. And so also Formula SAE is a huge networking um, opportunity for all its students. So companies, sponsors, and alumni, they continuously contact teams like us for job opportunities. And added to that, helping the team's social media presence um, basically draws in more pull, and we get more opportunities to share with the members, like job opportunities that we can say that our sponsor has an internship that they need a couple of people here for the summer, and that's pretty much how I got my first internship. So it's hugely important if the team uh, improves this aspect of the business team. So moving on. So the best way is to get a job is to network. So a lot of times you can apply online, you can go to a job fair, hand out your resumes, but hands down, knowing somebody is the easiest way to get a job. When you're applying online, you're essentially getting the scraps of uh, basically the job opportunities that uh, people can find, like friends or people they've already know, to offer them jobs with. So it's really difficult if you don't network. So I highly advise anybody and all of you, just start talking to people. Anybody you meet in any engineering or industry format, uh, remember their names, write them down, gather business cards, and remember details about them, so that if they do have an opportunity, you can go back to them and ask, hey, is there a job opportunity that would suit me? So begin your networking now. I know sometimes it's pretty difficult for people to start, but you gotta start practicing and communicating with uh, people and just making friends with in Formula. You never know when one of your friends or teammates would be able to offer you a job, and that happens all the time. So the same thing goes with like sponsors as well. Uh, Sponsors oftentimes they know the value of student engineers who have worked in SE environments, and so they know to pull from them. They are typically known as the creme de la crop of graduates. So uh, just being part of Form SAE is one of the best connections, in my opinion, to potential employers. And so other ways you can network is LinkedIn. So you should have a LinkedIn profile made, have your picture up there, have all your information, your basically your resume posted, and you know it's essentially a professional Facebook, but it allows a lot of recruiters to take a look at what you've got, and they use a lot of companies use LinkedIn just to hire straight off the bat. So there's also recruiters that you can contact, or say if you post a resume like on Monster or you post it on LinkedIn, there will be recruiters who contact you who essentially their job is to get you a job, and they essentially get a pay cut that the company who hired them pays them for, but they'll do a lot of like coaching and help for you to try to secure a job. Um, Hopefully, it's like in your interest and within your skill set. So there's also school job fairs and then job listings that you can look at. So San Jose State has their career center. I personally haven't used it, but it's a good idea to always maximize on all your opportunities. So I think I don't know if there was a recent one for San Jose State, but I remember it was around this time. So I would highly advise whenever there is one, you should go there. Even if there isn't a company that you're super interested in, just go there to practice. Just practice talking to people. Um, yeah, with COVID-19 and everything, I guess it's a bit of a woozy case, but um, yeah. So yeah, like mentioned, try to talk to as many people as you can. Remember the names. Ask for business cards, and I think a little tip is to record their little details you remember when you have your conversation with them. Say like in your contact list, so that when you look at their contact list and you call them, you have like little pointers that you can remember and talk to them about. So it's not just like a cold call where it's like, hey, uh, I'm looking for a job, and then the guy's like, who are you? You can mention maybe, oh yeah, we talked about your motorcycle or something like that. I think a lot of times that helps ease in the conversation. So next is applying. So this is kind of what happens when you don't have, or when you're trying to, in addition, use networking. So spend a lot of time reviewing your resumes. Make sure you spell check and use some good word choice. A lot of times I've seen that people just don't have their resumes spell checked, and quite frankly, that's just unacceptable. When you have spelling errors or grammatical errors on your resume, I think a lot of times employers just essentially just toss that resume out right then and there. So make sure you spend a lot of time reviewing and checking your resume. Ask friends and peers to review, and then also use a thesaurus for some fancy words that you can use. So when you're applying online, there's a couple ways you can do it. At least how I've tried doing it. You Google is obviously super helpful. You can look up like engineering job, mechanical engineering or something, and you'll get a bunch of searches. Like I mentioned, LinkedIn is also one, and then there's Monster, and then there's the specific company websites. Like you go to Lockheed Martin, you can go to BAE or Northrop Grumman and look for job postings there. So those are some ways to do it. Make sure that when you do send your resumes, um, typically it's better to send it as a PDF because their scanning software works best in PDF and not in Word. So, uh, and when you send it in Word, sometimes it's easier to be adulterated. So, try to always send it in PDF. And like I mentioned, applying online, it's at least in my experience and um, what I've seen is it's typically much lower chance of success than just knowing somebody and getting hired that way. Um, a lot of times you'll you can apply over 100 companies and you won't get a reply back. But then you know somebody who recommended you a job and you can get hired just like that. So um, it's not a hopeless case. I've gotten contacts and offers from jobs that I did apply to online, but it's in my opinion really difficult to go this route. So there's also in-person recruitment like job fairs that I mentioned, and for those you should prepare for it as if it were an interview. So you should be like researching the company and practicing the topics to discuss about on your resume and things like that. And when you do hand your resume to recruiters, good tip is the print your resume in some nice cardstock. I see a lot of times people handing in their resume and it's like some floppy paper. And if you want to stand out, um, cardstock is really says something to the employer. And then onto that, don't be discouraged if you've had little success. I think it's pretty common, especially with applying online. They won't even call you back, or they won't send you email that they rejected your letter. They just won't spend the time to. It's incredibly common for entry level jobs. I can't count the number of friends and peers I've known who've had difficulty for months on end just trying to find a job, especially just graduating. And then included on that as well, identify what you can improve on and work on them. So like if you think your uh, interviewing skills need some work, practice. And just because you're applying to a bunch of companies doesn't mean you're doing the best you could to uh, increase your chance of success of getting a job. It's really important that you work on your shortcomings. Like if you need to practice CAD, mock up something. If you want to work on FEA, you can practice that while also applying for jobs. Sometimes people graduate and they think applying for a job 24/7 is the only thing that they can be doing, but you can only be you can't applying for a job for 8 hours straight is not probably not the best way to spend your time. So so resume. I'm not gonna go into a complete like resume tutorial or anything. We could save that for another seminar, but I kind of listed out some major points that I thought were important whenever I look at a resume, what I look for, and what you should be uh, going over. So, whenever you list down uh, what you've done in your resume, you should be using action verbs. So, like performed, evaluated, and analyzed. And you can see in these example resumes I pulled off, they say increased or established. Um, you don't want to start your resume with saying like uh, I I guess you don't need to use like pronouns like I took a uh, I took this company's budget uh, or so, I don't know, I'm having trouble coming up with an example, but yeah, just use action verbs that illustrate what you did, and then kind of adding on to that is describe what you did, what you accomplished, and what impact you had. I've seen sometimes when I've reviewed teammates' resumes, sometimes they put down the accomplishment of what the team did, and that doesn't really tell anything to the employer. It says like, yeah, you were a part of this team, but they don't know exactly like what did you accomplish, what did you do for the team, and how did you uh, how did you affect the team by your actions. And additionally, you should quantify and emphasize what impact you had on the bottom line. So, say if you were able to increase the downforce on the car by adding a winglet or something, you can say that you reduced the lap time of the vehicle by this amount of seconds, and you're able to. That was the equivalent of like second place or something. So try to, as much as you can, try to add in numbers wherever you can. A lot of times, if you can add in numbers of like how much money you've saved, or you save the company or something, that's really good. Say maybe how much time you saved the manufacturing process or something. Save the schedule. That's usually a good one. Um, and then also, I think probably the biggest point is make your resume as concise and easy to read as possible. A lot of times I see resumes are just like filled with, people's projects and things that they've done with those projects, but it's basically like a wall of text. It's not really well formatted. It's difficult to read. And I'll tell you right now, people don't spend that much time reading resumes. They'll spend uh, honestly probably like 15 seconds just skimming over it. They'll read like your your title, where you worked, and maybe like two or three bullet points, and then they'll jump to the next one. It's You have to make it easy for the eye to follow, and very easy to read. So don't expect everybody to read every word you're gonna put on there, and you want to emphasize the main points early, so that you increase the chances of them reading what you want them to read uh, from the beginning. So a couple tips on that is utilize multiple fonts, use bolding and italicize, and then thoughtful spacing. So you can see on this resume, uh, they have multiple fonts to say like even just for your name, like make that a specific font, so that kind of stands out. And then the different font sizes that they use, italicize, like Smith Elementary, and they bolded West School District. Sometimes people just leave this all completely bolded. You want to try to contrast between words a lot of the times. So so that's it for resumes right now. Um, Included on that is cover letters. A lot of times, um, sometimes companies don't ask for a cover letter, but if you do have the opportunity to write one, you should. It's only going to help you, and it if you don't, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because people who do write one are just going to have that much more of an edge over your application. But I will say that a lot of times people don't spend that much time reading cover letters. If anything, sometimes they just read the resume and just don't read the cover letter. So people argue sometimes that cover letters aren't necessary, but if you want to maximize on your chance of success, you should always write one. And always personalize and cater it to that specific company. Don't use a cookie cutter cover letter. I mean, you can have like a cookie cutter one, but make sure you edit it and modify it for that specific company. And this a cover letter is your best opportunity to convey your passion for a job. So at least that's before an interview. You can't really. It's hard. It's difficult to convey that within the space boundaries of your resume. So if you do have the chance to write a cover letter, try to express your interest in the subject matter, and the passion you have for, say, learning in that field. And then preparing for the interview. So this is a lot of the bulk, I'd say, of trying to secure a job. So when you're preparing for the interview, make sure you research the company and what they do. Pre- Make sure you prepare questions about their company and their company cultures and job expectations. You want to go into the interview with basically a list of questions that you've made after reading on their website or something. Think of questions where it's like, oh, you guys are working on this project. I want to hear more about what you guys are doing here, and how maybe I can help improve or be a part of that. The more questions, the more detailed questions that you have, the more likely the employer will think, oh wow, this guy or this girl really really wants this job. I think they're the right fit because they're so passionate about it, or um, something like that. Make sure you ask about the hiring timeline, um, day-to-day tasks of the position, and the work-life balance. At least those are the common questions I typically ask. It's obviously ask any questions that are important to you, but if you're going through multiple interviews, you want to know when those would align with your other interviews. Say if you do get an offer or something, they only give you maybe a couple days to accept. And so, and then there's also obviously what exactly would you be doing for the job? They'll give you a somewhat vague answer, but try to be as specific as you can, or ask them to be specific as they can. You can sometimes ask them. I've asked interviewers like what exactly do they do on a day-to-day basis, and then sometimes like what would they expect out of me. It's important to know kind of what you're gonna be heading into, because if it's not really a good fit, it's kind of a waste of both the company and your time uh, to get you hired on and trained. So same thing with work-life balance. If it doesn't fit your lifestyle and you know that you're not into working like 80-hour work weeks, then you should start looking for other opportunities. And then also make sure you look them up on Glassdoor. I think a lot of times Glassdoor provides some pretty good insight of what the company is kind of like. Obviously, it's not going to be. Uh, it's basically like Amazon reviews, I guess, in terms of how accurate they are. But look them up on Glassdoor, see what other people say about it. Take a look at what their average compensation rates are. That's usually pretty helpful heading into the interview. And then on your resume, you should be able to talk to every single bullet point you put on there. If you put on a topic on your resume and you can't speak to it, it's just not gonna bode well for you. You should be able to go into detail of like why was it even worth it for you to put that on your resume, like project management. You managed let's say like 20 people on a team or something, and you were able to successfully complete a project like that. If you say you designed an assembly or something, be able to explain like what the assembly was and what was its function and all that jazz. But yeah, I would practice on making sure that you know how to speak to every bullet point. Sometimes if you're going back on your resume or going interviewing at another uh, company, say even like after like 1 or 2 years, it's just a good idea to run through all of those bullet points you listed. Um, and so kind of related to that is try to recall any of your past experiences, especially in like Formula SE, where you've come across any um, issue that or problem that needed to be solved. Um, a lot of times people recommend the STAR method, which is situation, task, action, and result, where essentially the employer is going to ask you, okay, can you tell me about this time where you had trouble getting a project done or something? Um, in when you head into an interview, you should have essentially a memory bank of kind of situations that you've been in that you can pull from and try to lean on to explain some of these kind of behavioral type questions. So they'll ask you just that question, um, and then you're gonna explain what the situation was, um, and then explain what needed to be done, and then what did you actually do for your action, and then what was the outcome of that result. So this basically kind of tells the employer what your thought process is and kind of how you handle situations, and if you've learned from them. So I highly recommend try to maybe try writing down some past events that you can remember, and then try to essentially have a memory bank of them when you get into the interview. And then there's two types of questions that are typically asked in interviews. So there's behavioral and then technical questions. So uh, behavioral questions are essentially just to test how you fit in with the team and how well you can communicate. How do you work with a large number of teammates, or how do you problem solve essentially. Um, you should be prepared to answer any of the typical questions you can find on Google. Say like, what was your biggest accomplishment, or what are your strengths and weaknesses? That should fly off the head right off the bat, really easily. I've personally, I've been asked like questions of like, can you tell me about an example of how you're able to communicate with a team, and it it doesn't have to be engineering related, or it doesn't have to be anything you've learned in school. I've pulled out the example of, say, um, I used to play Counter-Strike, and being part of a team, um, you have to be able to communicate effectively and efficiently. And you got like really short amount of time where you have to convey information to your team members, and part of that, is being able to communicate in proper tone, or in the right volume, and all of that. So I pulled examples that aren't from engineering, and you should be able to do that too. And so there's also the technical questions like I mentioned. Um, it depends on the position that you apply for and the company. Sometimes there's companies that ask question or don't really ask too in-depth technical questions. They kind of just trust that the fact that you are a student going through university, and or that you've already graduated, or your GPA that you put down on your resume. Sometimes they don't really ask any technical questions, but there are companies that do have a rigorous technical uh, gauntlet essentially. So in those cases, definitely review what's on the job description, and try to research and recall maybe from your textbooks or looking online what you need to know for that job. So like I used to work at Honda Performance Development as a performance engineer, and initially when I interviewed for that job, I didn't I didn't really have that much experience with engines, and so I spent essentially 3 days just learning as much as I could on uh, how engines worked, and making sure I knew thermodynamic cycles to be able to explain to them. And I I had to explain how a Carnot cycle works over an Otto cycle in one of my interviews. And so if you come across that, make sure you're prepared. Um, Pulling out your textbooks is a good idea a lot of times, but also just doing due diligence to study essentially for those difficult uh, interviews. So when you actually get into the interview, so there's typically a phone interview, and then there's a in-person interview. Um, it usually just starts with a HR recruiter who kind of gets your basic detail and your background, your availability, and excuse me, they'll um, they'll send you to a hiring manager or a lead for you to have your phone interview. So in that case, you might get some technical questions, or sometimes it's just behavioral. And if they like you enough, then they'll invite you for an in-person interview. Sometimes they'll have like multiple phone interviews. It just depends on company to company, or even group to group. So, but that's how I've usually seen um, phone interviews, and I guess interviewing in general start. They typically, um, my my recommendations for whenever you have a phone interview, Uh, you should note down what the interviewer's name and what their position was, and any other detail that you can remember about them. You, so like sometimes if you do well on the phone interview and you get to meet them on site, you can have a little chat and be a little more personable, and then or ask questions about their specific position. Make sure you find a secluded area without distractions when you have your phone interview. You don't want to have your roommates blasting music when you're trying to concentrate and speak with a potential employer. And then a pro tip that I have is when you're on a phone interview, you should smile. I think it just helps in conveying a like light tone that people enjoy speaking to you. If you're kind of monotone and it sounds a bit depressing, and sometimes that kind of, I guess, tone is not the best for working on a team. So try to make sure you have a little life in you when you talk to employers. I think it says a lot about your communication skills, and it's not just technical knowledge a lot of times that people are looking for. It's just how well do you work on a team and communicate, because a lot of times they just assume you're able to do the work that they need you to do. And then going on to the in-person interview, once you get to that stage, they're typically focused on technical, at least in my experience. But they can also be behavioral. So, kind of example for me was I was once asked how to. I was once given a sprinkler, and I was asked, "Can you explain this to me?" And so they from that they could tell what was going through on my head, how was I trying to dismantle the sprinkler, and kind of understand what my technical knowledge of how something like that would work. So be prepared for uh, both technical and behavioral, but I've typically seen that they usually focus in on the technical side of things. You should also be prepared if you need to be able to draw. So like say if you had to draw on your phone of how something works or explain something, um, that's typically really helpful. So in-person interviews, and actually this applies to phone interviews as well. Sometimes it's multiple one-on-one um, interviews. I've gone through interviews where I've had to talk through a round of like 6 engineers, and so that was basically my whole day, and it gets pretty exhausting. Uh, but they usually want to be 100% sure that everybody on the team would agree that this person should be uh, hired for the company. Um, Other times there it's just a group interview. They'll have like a group of engineers or uh, a manager plus a couple engineers interviewing you. Typically, that's in my opinion that's a more useful um, expenditure of time, but it depends from company to company. And then when you go into your in-person interview, I highly advise you to bring work examples that you've done in Formula SAE. The cool thing about Formula SAE is that all of this is not under NDA, or you're not you weren't actually hired from a company to do any of this work. And so this is all work that you can readily show your potential employer that, hey, I did this work. Here's some like pretty in-depth technical um, work that FEA you've done, like CAD, you've made wiring diagrams, or some analysis that you can show them. Uh, when you're actually in industry, it's kind of extremely frowned upon to share what you've done with another company. And typically, if you do share something with a company, that you're essentially telling them that you're not afraid to say if you moved on, you're gonna give their information away. So with Formula, it's a lot easier for you as a graduate to be able to show your work off. And so you can print out pictures of like what you've manufactured or something, and be able to present that at your in-person interview. Um, I think that really helps a lot of times. And then another advice that I think a lot of you should already know: overdress, but you should never underdress. If they ask for, if the people there wear a polo, or they even just wear a shirt or something, just go there in at least a dress shirt and tie. It won't hurt you. If anything, it'll just make you look uh, more confident and more serious that you want the job. And then, as always, make sure you have a firm handshake. It, if you don't if you have a loose handshake, it just doesn't scream confidence, right? So a couple more tips on interviewing. Try to be personable. Uh, Make sure that you kind of express that you have like a personality, that you're someone who'd be fun to work with. Maybe you don't have to say that you're work fun to be working with, but just that uh, you'd be a easy member of their team to work with. Try to show passion in what you're applying for. I think showing interest is really important for uh, an employer to choose you, because they don't want you to say, oh, or they don't want you to be hired on. They train you for a couple months, and then you leave because you just weren't that interested in the job. It kind of wastes both of your time and money. So um, and then also express your willingness and eagerness to learn. I think even if you don't really have much background in a subject, if you can express that you you want the job just because you want to learn about like high performance engines, then a lot of times they'll they'll take that to note, and I think it weighs heavily on their decision to want to hire you. And then also have a notepad and pen ready, like at all the time. So whenever they tell you anything about their company, start writing that down. If they tell you any details about their hiring timeline, or just anything that you can take a note on, you should write your notes. If you like, writing notes in front of an interviewer shows that you have a lot of attention to detail and that you listen to them, and that it's not just going from one ear to the next. It's really important that you remember what your tasks are in a day-to-day job, and if you take notes, it says a lot. Personally, like even when I'm in meetings, just on the phone, I'll click my pen when there's some action item that needs to be done, just so that people on the phone hear that I am listening and taking notes of what action item needs to be done. In my opinion, I think it really helps. Um, don't be afraid to ask for more time to think about a question. I've come across a lot of questions that were difficult to answer technically, and it's it's not really shameful for you to ask for a little time to think about. Sometimes people think you've got to be able to answer questions right on the dime, but you shouldn't be afraid to ask for a little more time. Sometimes they do ask some very difficult questions, and maybe you have to do some calculations in your head, or remember something in the past that you looked into. Um, and also, if you have the luxury of multiple interviews, you should try using the interviews even for places that you're not that interested in getting a job, or that you don't want to get a job there. Try using them as practice for the ones that you do want. And then on top of that, if you are interviewing with other companies, you should mention it in your interview. You should talk about it, say when you ask about their hiring timeline. So it puts pressure on them to respond back to you whether or not they'll give you an offer or reject your offer, and it also gives you leverage. If you've got multiple companies looking at you, they might want to increase your compensation just to secure you. So, all in all, the interview is essentially like a date. You not only need to attract them, but the company needs to attract you. So if you are a competent engineer, you should know your self-worth, and companies will pay you what you're worth if you make them. So make sure that you are going to the company um, that you want, and it's not just about you trying to convince them to hire you. Uh, a lot of times there's companies where you're not very interested in working just on that subject matter, and that should mean a lot to you, and what that compensation needs to be in order for you to work there. Um, and another thing is, don't be afraid of failure, but make sure that you learn from your mistakes. I personally I've gone through countless interviews, and there's a lot of moments in my head where I'm like, wow, why did I even say that? Or instances where they asked me a question and I should have been able to answer that, but I couldn't. And so I went back and I read up on how a jet turbine works, and then I was able to, the more practice that you have, the better. Uh, but understand that oftentimes you'll come across interviews that you're not gonna do 100% on. So just learn from it and try again next time. So after you have your interview, if they haven't already contacted you for an offer or a rejection, uh, send a thank you letter maybe like 1, 2 weeks, or even maybe like 2 or 3 days after, either email or call whoever your point of contact was. And that shows persistence and follow through, which is pretty important when you're on your normal job. Um, and then there's also the chance of you just being ghosted, which has happened a couple times for me personally. So I think it's pretty common. It's it's it kind of sucks, but you can they might not spend the time to give you a rejection letter when they've got multiple other candidates that they need to work through. So and then if you do get an offer after all of that interviewing and talking to people, so if you get an offer, um, you can use an offer from another company to negotiate whatever package that they sent you. So that's why it's super important to try to pursue multiple interviews. I think, yeah, as even as a entry level engineer, if you can do this, um, it it helps just even your starting pay, or um, say maybe starting bonus or anything like that. So if you even if you are like super inclined on getting a job at this one company, try to leverage off other companies so that you can uh, basically increase the benefits you get from the company that you do want to work at. So if you do have that kind of leverage, you should talk compensation, starting bonus, like I mentioned. Sometimes those companies that'll offer a relocation compensation, and then stock options, overtime, and benefits, depending on what kind of company you get to. Um, I think I've mentioned this a couple times. If you have more interviews lined up, make sure you ask for the hiring timeline, just so that you know when you need to make a decision. Sometimes companies are like, "Oh yeah, we don't we don't need to hire you for like 2 months out or something. But then there's other companies where like we need a decision within 3 days. And so sometimes that really complicates your decision making. Say if like there's a company that you were really interested in getting a position at, but you're just waiting on a response from them. That it be wary of that because that happens all the time. And then also with your offer, there's typically three things to choose from, which is your location, your pay, and subject interest. And a lot of times people say, of these three things, pick two. So you'll get good location, good pay, but you don't really like the topic that you're working on. And then sometimes there's good pay and it's a good subject matter, but the location sucks. So it happens all the time. And if you're able to get the holy trinity of all three, then you struck gold. But a lot of times that's not the case. Also consider, I guess this kind of goes into pay, but what um, what is your career growth potential in that position? Say if there's a lot of room to move up, or does it seem like it's stagnant position? Um, are you bound to say like one pay grade for X amount of time? It's really important. Sometimes it's better, in my opinion, it's better to take a lower pay for getting into a company where you'll learn a lot more and be essentially ran through the ringer to uh, learn a lot of technical information that you can use to specialize and focus your skills on, which you could use to leverage for, say, like another uh, job opportunity in the future. So your base pay that you get on your first offer or something, always always think about what that position's career growth potential would be like. So if you do accept the offer, then you've got a job. And sometimes it's pretty intimidating. At least for me, it's there's when I did work at Honda, I was pretty intimidated. I didn't really know much about how high performance engines worked, and sometimes that's pretty common. Um, I would recommend always carry a notepad and a pen everywhere you go when whenever you're on your first job. Actually, I recommend that all the time. Just being able to record down information that you can look back to, write down what people tell you so you can go back and research it on your own time is massively important. And it shows that it shows your peers and your supervisors and boss that you do pay attention and that you listen. And on top of that, like as people always say, fake it till you make it. Um, nobody's gonna, nobody knows how to do their job on the first day, but you learn as you go. And essentially, they hired you uh, so that you can learn how to do your job. They didn't hire because they know that you already know how to do everything. So keep that in mind. And then also try your best to figure things out before you ask for help. Um, but also don't be afraid to ask for help. Um, it's better to ask for clarification rather than making mistakes and requiring rework later down the road. It usually costs more money to fix a mistake uh, later in the process than it does early in the process. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help, but also try to figure things out as much as you can before you ask for help. And then something else I would also recommend is try to always bring solutions to your boss and not issues. They don't want to hear like, oh, uh, the line is down because we're missing a part or something. You should go to your boss and tell them, okay, we can purchase a part from this supplier within this amount of lead time, or we can get it at a cheaper price going to another supplier, um, but it might take a little longer. And you want to provide those options to your boss, but you don't want to just go to your boss and just tell them, yeah, we're missing a part, um, and then have them tell you what the solution should be. And then the last thing that I would recommend is always follow through with your responsibilities. I think within your teammates and your colleagues and your peers, following through earns you a lot of trust within your team. Make sure that you respond to emails, that um, you keep to your word, that you're going to look into an issue and that you solve it, so that people come to you and rely on you for the bigger and more important things, and that gives you more leverage when you're asking for uh, a raise or being promoted. Um, but yep, and so that's the majority of tips I have for when you do get a job, and that kind of ends my presentation for how you land a job 101. Is there any questions or anything? I know I've been pretty much talking for very long. My mouth's kind of dry, but
Hey James, I actually had a question.
go for it.
So going back to when you said those moments where you didn't know the answer to one of the technical questions, or well, hopefully a technical question, what was your response in those kinds of situations?
So there's so I'll tell you what I initially did and then what I improved on after. So the first time is like I couldn't answer a question that they gave me because I just didn't know it, and I was like I don't know. Essentially that was essentially my answer. But after looking back on it and thinking about it, I I went into my next interviews saying that, oh, I don't know it now, but I can research this in the later, or this is how I would have solved this problem, or I think this is how that problem should be solved. Try to do your best to answer um, with your best logical thought processing, and hopefully that'll get you there. Because you're not always gonna 100% know everything, but just try to work your way around whatever question that they give you.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. Anybody else have any questions? Or they wanted to comment on anything I mentioned?
I have a quick question.
Yep.
Hi. So you said you graduated from UCSD, right?
Yep.
So now you work at a like San Jose FSE with the electrical team.
Yeah, so I'm doing part-time masters, and then I'm chief engineer for electric, but I'm also working full-time for BAE Systems.
Oh, I see.
Yep.
Um, did you have a favorite company working,
Um, so
were
there's yeah, there's
or
there's pros and
sorry?
cons to the. Sorry, maybe I let you finish your question.
No, no, go ahead. That was it.
Okay. Yeah, so there's pros and cons to each company that you'll go to. Um, in at least technically, I preferred Honda because there's a lot of information that I learned, and a lot of skills that I learned there. It's pretty interesting working on high performance engines. Basically, it was working on IndyCar race engines on dynos and trying to squeeze as much power out of them as possible. So technically, I was really interested in that, but the pay wasn't that great, as well as the location was kind of um, not the best for me. I found that after like going to where I work now, BAE, I'm much happier in the location I am, and I'm being compensated more than I was there. And so, you always have to weigh the differences between everything. But and then kind of the primary uh, deciding factor behind that too was um, in terms of my career growth. I knew I didn't want to work in internal combustion engines forever, and in my opinion, it is kind of a dying technology, whether or not people want to accept it. So it was something that I was like, it's pretty cool to learn, but eventually, I kind of want to move on, and I don't see myself working in this industry for the rest of my life or something.
I see. That, that's actually pretty informative. Would you say that engineers, when they graduate, get their bachelor, would make six figures or no?
It depends on the industry that you're in. If you're software engineering, I think it's a lot easier to hit six figures. If you're mechanical, it's much harder. The market's a lot more saturated, and I think the same goes for electrical. I think the average starting salary for electrical is a little higher than mechanical, but nothing as far as a bachelor's straight out of graduation. Software engineers are probably gonna blow the rest out of the water.
Yeah, software. Like I've known a couple of software engineers that make six figures right after graduation, but I wasn't sure about how like the works for the mechanical and electrical. I know electrical down the road, like after 15 or 20 years of experience, you could make up to 500,000.
Yeah, it depends on how well you specialize. It's really on the opportunity that you're given. I would say it's not very typical to go 500,000. That sounds like that person's going high up on the food chain. Um, but just depends on what the industry that they're working in, I'd say.
I see. All right. Well, thank you for answering my question. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Hey, James.
Yep. What's up?
Uh, so this isn't really involved with like interviewing, but you said you were at Honda and then you left for BAE, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So my question is, how do you go about like leaving? I guess because I once worked at a place and then I left and I didn't want to burn any bridges, so I just told my boss like, hey, I'm leaving for school reasons, but I might consider coming back later on. But how would you go about that considering you're straight up leaving for another company?
Yeah, so a lot of times, yeah, it's a good idea to be considerate about not burning bridges, but people understand that you need to do what's best for you and not what's best for the company. Like, even if you do play like an important role in the company, um, but send in your 2 week notice or even earlier, um, and tell your boss, I'm planning on leaving, and then try to work out a plan of like how to leave the important information or details that you have, for them to continue working on, and then transfer all the files that they need, or explain how your process and whatever you're doing works. And I think that helps smooth in that transition. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much.
I could try elaborating more if if you think wasn't good enough.
Oh, because it's like I was wondering if there's anything more to it because I also did the two notice and then like I explained my situation to the boss and uh, gave him all the tasks like and how to do them certain things.
Yeah, I don't know if
So I
there's
was wondering if there's like more to it.
yeah, I can't say that there is that much more to it, um other than you just like not leaving, because eventually you just gotta do what's best for you. So Yeah, I think you did, I think you made the right moves, but whether or not they received it well or not is, I guess, up to them, right?
Confirm.
Any other questions, comments?
Is this gonna be saved anywhere so that we can look at it for future reference?
Yeah, I am recording it myself, so I can post this in the SAE Workshops folder, and I can send over the slides as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Anybody else? All right. Well, looks like that's all the questions. Thank you everybody who attended. I hope you got something out of this. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to holler at me.
Thanks a lot, James.
Yep.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks. Very informative.